In the time it takes you to watch this video, somewhere in the world, a healthcare worker will kill a patient. And no one will ever know. Not the family, not the coroner, not the police, because the death certificate will say cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, signed by the very institution where the killing happened. Hospitals are not just places where people die. For a specific kind of predator, they are the most sophisticated killing infrastructure ever designed. And every single country on Earth has the same blind spots. This isn't a story about one killer. This is the story of a system, a global system, that manufactures invisibility for the most dangerous people who walk its halls. Every serial killer faces the same three problems: access to victims, a weapon that won't raise suspicion, and a plausible reason to be at the scene. Street killers spend years solving these problems. Medical serial killers walk into the solution on their very first shift. Think about what a hospital actually provides: an endless supply of vulnerable people who cannot leave, a pharmacy stocked with lethal drugs measured in milligrams, private rooms with closed doors and curtains drawn, a uniform that grants you unquestioned access to all of it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A nurse working a standard rotation might be alone with 30 to 40 patients in a single week, each one sedated, confused, or too sick to comprehend what's happening to them, each one already expected to deteriorate. And unlike almost any other environment on Earth, a hospital is a place where the presence of death doesn't trigger suspicion. It triggers paperwork. This isn't a design flaw. It's the design itself. Researchers who study this phenomenon have a name for it. They call it the healthcare serial killer paradox. The very conditions that make modern hospitals function, the access, the drugs, the trust, the proximity to death, are the exact same conditions that make murder invisible. And that paradox operates identically in Tokyo, in London, in Sao Paulo, and in rural Kansas. No healthcare system on Earth has solved it. Most haven't even acknowledged it exists. Here's a number that should unsettle you. In a mid-sized hospital, say 500 beds, between 40 and 60 patients will die every single month. That's 1 to 2 deaths per day. Every day, year after year. Death isn't an anomaly in a hospital. It's Tuesday, and that single fact changes everything about how killing works inside those walls. When a body is found in an apartment or a park, the absence of life demands an explanation. Detectives arrive. Evidence is collected. Questions get asked. But when a patient dies in an ICU at 3 in the morning, the explanation is already written. Heart failure, sepsis, organ shutdown. The disease did it. Medical serial killers don't need to hide the body. They don't need to establish an alibi. The body stays exactly where it is, in a bed the institution owns, and the cover story writes itself. In most countries, if a patient dies in hospital and a physician signs the death certificate listing a plausible medical cause, that's the end of it. There is no investigation. There's nothing to investigate. A 2019 analysis published in the Journal of Patient Safety estimated that between 22,000 and 33,000 hospital deaths per year in the United States alone may involve some form of criminal action. And fewer than 1% are ever referred for forensic examination. 1%. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 99 out of every 100 potential crimes unexamined. The death certificate is filed. The bed is cleaned. And by morning, there's a new patient in it. Now imagine you're the person trying to identify a killer inside this system. The first thing any investigator looks for is a pattern. Deaths cluster around a person, a time, a location. You find the cluster, you find the killer. That's how it works in theory. But hospitals are designed, structurally, operationally designed, to prevent exactly that kind of pattern recognition. Staff rotate through day shifts, night shifts, and swing shifts on schedules that change every week. A nurse might work the cardiac ward on Monday, the general medical floor on Wednesday, and cover the ICU on Friday. Patients transfer between units. Temporary agency staff cycle in and out with no continuity. Handoff notes are brief, clinical, and focused on treatment, not on who was in the room when the patient's condition changed. So when deaths tick upward on a particular ward, the signal gets shattered, scattered across different shifts, different wards, and different personnel records that nobody is cross-referencing in real time. By the time someone notices something feels off, if they notice at all, the data is buried in months of scheduling spreadsheets and discharge summaries that would take a forensic statistician to untangle. This is exactly what happened in northern Germany. Niels Hergel, a critical care nurse, would eventually be convicted of killing 85 patients, with investigators believing the true number exceeds 300. He operated across 2 hospitals over 5 years. Staff at Oldenburg Hospital noticed an alarming number of cardiac emergencies on his shifts. His colleagues literally nicknamed him Resuscitation Rambo. But because his rotations shifted and his ward assignments changed constantly, no one assembled the deaths into a single, coherent pattern until more than 300 people were dead. But here's what makes this truly infuriating. In almost every single medical serial killer case, almost without exception, someone raised the alarm, often multiple people, often years before an arrest was ever made, and they were ignored. Hospitals run on rigid hierarchies, doctors outrank nurses, senior staff outrank junior staff, and administration outranks everyone when institutional reputation and legal liability are on the table. When a junior nurse approaches a supervisor and says something feels wrong about a colleague, that patients seem to deteriorate more often on their shifts, that medication counts don't add up, the response is almost never a formal investigation. It's a conversation about workplace morale, about not making baseless accusations, about the legal exposure that comes with defaming a colleague. And in the worst cases, the cases that cost the most lives, it's a quiet transfer. Moving the suspected killer to another ward, or another hospital entirely, where they begin killing again with a clean slate. At Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, England, nurse Victorino Chua contaminated saline bags with insulin, poisoning patients over a period of months. Multiple staff members flagged suspicious incidents to management. Internal investigations concluded, officially, that nothing definitive could be proven. It took a police investigation, triggered by a statistical anomaly that the hospital itself had failed to act on, to finally connect the poisonings. The hierarchy protected the institution. It did not protect the patients. And this pattern, alarm raised, alarm dismissed, bodies accumulate, has repeated in every country where medical serial killers have been caught. Which means it's repeating right now in countries where they haven't been caught yet. And then there are the cases that reveal something even more disturbing about these killers. A kind of contempt for their victims that goes beyond the act of killing itself. In 2014, at the Umberto Eye Hospital in Lugo, a small city in northern Italy, nurse Daniela Poggiali was arrested after a pattern of deaths on her ward caught the attention of local police. The mortality rate during her shifts was dramatically higher than during any other nurses, a statistical outlier so extreme it should have triggered an investigation months earlier. But what truly made this case infamous was what investigators found on Poggiali's phone. Selfies. She had been photographing herself smiling, posing next to patients who had just died. Some of those patients, prosecutors alleged, she had personally killed with lethal injections of potassium chloride. The Italian legal system struggled with this case for years. Poggiali was convicted, then acquitted on appeal, then convicted again, a legal odyssey that exposed a fundamental truth about prosecuting hospital murders. Proving the crime requires toxicological evidence, and toxicological evidence for potassium chloride is extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Here's why. Potassium stops the heart almost instantly. But potassium is also naturally present in every cell of the human body. After death, as cells break down, potassium levels rise on their own. So unless a highly specific blood test is ordered within hours of death, and someone already has a reason to suspect foul play, the evidence of murder literally dissolves into the chemistry of normal decomposition. Poggiali worked in a system that handed her the weapon, the opportunity, the victims, and the alibi, all in the same building. All on the same shift. Now here's the detail from the Niels Hergel case that should genuinely frighten you. Because it's not unique to Germany, it happens everywhere. When staff at Oldenburg Hospital grew suspicious, when the cardiac emergencies on Hergel's shifts became statistically impossible to ignore, the hospital didn't contact the police. They didn't file a report. They didn't even fire him. They gave him a satisfactory reference letter and transferred him to Delmenhorst Hospital, 40 kilometers away. At Delmenhorst, he killed at least 60 more people. Researchers call this the transfer problem, and it is arguably the single most dangerous systemic failure in global healthcare. When a hospital suspects a staff member of harming patients, the institution faces a calculation, and it's not a medical calculation. It's a financial one. A public investigation means lawsuits, media exposure, regulatory scrutiny, and catastrophic damage to the hospital's reputation. A quiet transfer costs nothing. You write a neutral reference. You wish them well. And the problem, the killing, becomes someone else's responsibility. In 2016, a parliamentary inquiry in the United Kingdom found that at least 4 NHS trusts had transferred healthcare workers suspected of patient harm rather than reporting them to authorities. 4 that were documented. The actual number, investigators noted, was likely significantly higher. The same pattern has been identified in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and across South America. In Uruguay, a cluster of unexplained deaths in a Montevideo hospital in the early 2010s led to an internal review. Healthcare workers were quietly reassigned. No criminal charges were filed. The families of the dead were never informed that an investigation had even taken place. Every country thinks this is someone else's problem. It's everyone's problem. Let's talk about weapons. Because the drugs available inside any hospital pharmacy could stock the most efficient assassination toolkit in human history. And most of them are nearly impossible to detect once the patient is dead. We've already covered potassium chloride mimics natural cardiac arrest, undetectable after normal decomposition. But that's just one entry on a very long list. Insulin causes fatal hypoglycemia, blood sugar crashes, the brain shuts down, the heart follows. Standard post-mortem toxicology screens don't test for exogenous insulin. Unless someone specifically orders an insulin assay and already suspects murder, it won't be found. Digoxin, a common cardiac medication that becomes lethal in slightly elevated doses. The difference between therapeutic and fatal can be measured in nanograms. In a patient already taking digoxin, an extra dose is virtually indistinguishable from a prescribing error. Succinylcholine, a muscle relaxant used in anesthesia, it paralyzes the diaphragm. The patient suffocates silently in their own bed, and the drug metabolizes into compounds naturally present in the body within minutes. By the time anyone checks, the murder weapon has chemically erased itself. These aren't exotic substances. They're on the shelf in every hospital on Earth, and tracking them is disturbingly inadequate. Efren Saldivar, a respiratory therapist in Glendale, California, confessed to killing between 40 and 50 patients using Pavulin, a paralytic agent. He disconnected patients from ventilators and injected the drug. When investigators asked how he avoided detection for nearly a decade, his response was 4 words long. "Nobody counts the vials." 4 words. That's not a confession. That's an indictment of the entire system. Every case we've discussed so far, Germany, Italy, England, the United States, these are countries with relatively advanced forensic infrastructure. Countries where autopsies are available, toxicology labs are funded, and media scrutiny creates at least some external pressure for accountability. Now consider what happens in healthcare systems where none of that infrastructure exists. In large parts of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America, hospital mortality data isn't centrally tracked. Death certificates are handwritten on paper forms and filed in archives that no one cross-references. Autopsies are rare. They're expensive. They require specialists who don't exist in many regions, and in many cultures they're actively resisted by families. And forensic toxicology, the one scientific tool capable of detecting a medical killing, may not be available within an entire province or state. In 2017, a devastating series of infant deaths at BRD Medical College in Gorakhpur, India, drew international attention. More than 60 children died within a single week. While the immediate cause was traced to failures in the hospital's oxygen supply, a systemic negligence catastrophe, investigators privately acknowledged a deeper problem. In a system where forensic infrastructure is this limited, distinguishing between negligence, systemic failure, and deliberate harm becomes essentially impossible. The patients in these systems, overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly from marginalized communities, occupy the most dangerous intersection in global healthcare. They're in institutions with the least oversight, treated by staff under the least scrutiny, and when they die, they receive the least forensic attention. If medical serial killers thrive in the hospitals of Germany and England, imagine what thrives in the hospitals that nobody is watching at all. You might be thinking the answer is straightforward. More autopsies, better toxicology screening, catch the killers after the fact, but the structural barriers to even this basic solution are staggering. In the United States, the autopsy rate for hospital deaths has collapsed, from roughly 50% in the 1960s to fewer than 5% today. In the UK, the rate sits around 15%, and that includes coroner-mandated inquests, not routine screening. In much of the world, the rate is effectively zero. This decline didn't happen by accident. Each autopsy costs between $2,000 and $5,000. They require trained pathologists, and there's a global shortage so severe that some regions have a single forensic pathologist serving a population of over 1 million people. And critically, within a hospital's culture, requesting an autopsy on a patient who died under your colleague's care is often seen as an accusation. It creates friction. It implies failure, so it doesn't happen. Even when an autopsy is performed, the standard toxicology panel tests for maybe 40 to 60 common substances. The number of hospital-available drugs that can cause death and won't appear on that panel, hundreds. To detect insulin poisoning or succinylcholine or a potassium overdose, a pathologist has to specifically request those tests. They have to already suspect murder before they have the evidence that would prove it. It's a perfect closed loop. You can't detect the killing without suspicion. You can't generate suspicion without detection. And inside that closed loop, the death certificates keep getting signed, the beds keep getting filled, and the killers keep going to work. So here's the question that every researcher in this field eventually confronts. If these killers are this hard to detect, if the system itself is architecturally designed to conceal them, then how many are operating right now? The honest answer is, we don't know. And every estimate is terrifying. Criminologist Eric Hickey, who maintains the most comprehensive international database of healthcare serial killers, has cataloged over 150 confirmed cases worldwide since 1970. These are the ones we know about, the ones where someone was caught, tried, and convicted. But Hickey's own analysis suggests these detected cases represent perhaps 10 to 15% of the actual number. The rest retire, they move, they die. And their victims remain uncounted on death certificates that list natural causes. A 2006 study published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences estimated that the average medical serial killer operates for approximately 8 years before detection, killing between 15 and 30 patients during that window. Apply those numbers across the world's healthcare systems, including the ones with no forensic capacity at all, and the math becomes difficult to comprehend. Former FBI profiler Robert Ressler stated it more directly than anyone. He estimated that at any given time, between 30 and 40 active medical serial killers are operating in the United States alone. Not globally, just America. And the truly shattering part of all of this, the thing that keeps researchers in this field awake, is that we will never have an accurate count. For every Niels Hergel who finally gets caught, for every Daniela Poggiali whose selfies betray her, there are others who simply stop, who walk away, who take their body count into retirement, into silence, into the permanent anonymity of death certificates that were never questioned and graves that were never opened. What you've just heard isn't a problem that belongs to one country or one healthcare system. It's a structural vulnerability woven into the way every hospital on Earth operates. The access, the drugs, the trust, the silence. The question is not whether this is happening right now. It is. The question is what it would actually take to make these invisible killings visible. If this changed the way you think about the institutions we trust most, share it with someone who should hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the cases and systems the world would rather not talk about, because we are just getting started.